Somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia, inside churches carved directly into solid rock, sits a version of the Bible that most Christians in the West have never even heard of, let alone read. It isn't a variant translation or a slightly reordered table of contents. It's an entirely different, considerably larger book, built around dozens of chapters that don't exist anywhere in the Protestant Bible, sitting on most American nightstands, and don't exist in the Catholic Bible either. We're talking about entire books, ancient texts, describing rebel angels descending to earth to teach forbidden knowledge to humanity. A secret history of the years leading up to Noah's flood. A set of Maccabees stories that share a name with a familiar biblical book, but tell completely different stories. And manuscripts so old that when researchers finally dated them properly using radiocarbon testing, the results moved the origin of illuminated Christian art back by centuries, earlier than anything found anywhere else on the planet. This is the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible. And once you understand how it came to look so different from every other Bible in the Christian world, you start to realize that the story of how the Bible actually took shape is far stranger and far less settled than most people ever get taught. Stay with this one because it involves a 4th century African kingdom that beat most of Europe to Christianity by centuries. A doctrinal split so consequential, it's still shaping which books different churches consider scripture 1,600 years later. A text so seriously valued by an ancient Jewish sect that they copied it more times than they copied the book of Genesis. A Scottish explorer chasing the source of the Nile who accidentally reintroduced a lost scripture to Europe. And a set of scrolls that sat hidden in desert caves for 2,000 years, waiting to prove that a small, isolated church in the African highlands had been quietly right about something the rest of Christendom had set aside and largely forgotten. To understand why this version of the Bible looks so different, you first have to understand just how old and how isolated the Christian tradition behind it actually is. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest continuously functioning Christian institutions anywhere on earth, with its formal establishment dating back to the 4th century AD, under King Ezana of the Kingdom of Aksum, who made Christianity the official state religion. To put that timeline in perspective, when the theologian Augustine of Hippo was born in the year 354 AD, a man whose writings would go on to shape virtually the entire foundation of Western Christian theology, Ethiopia had already been an officially Christian nation for a full generation. This wasn't a faith imported centuries later by European missionaries arriving on colonial ships, the story many people mistakenly assume when they first hear about African Christianity. Ethiopian Christianity predates the conversion of most of Europe entirely. It predates the Great Schism that eventually split Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic branches. It even predates the Byzantine Empire's own formal adoption of Christianity as a state religion. The word Tewahedo itself, in Ge'ez, Ethiopia's ancient liturgical language, means made one, or unified, referring to the church's specific theological position on the nature of Christ, a stance that would eventually put Ethiopian Christianity at odds with the rest of the Christian world at one of the most consequential meetings in the entire history of the faith. That meeting was the Council of Chalcedon, held in 451 AD, one of a series of ecumenical councils where bishops from across the Christian world gathered to settle disputes over doctrine, essentially voting on what would count as official, accepted Christian belief in what would be labeled heresy. Chalcedon dealt specifically with the nature of Christ, ultimately ruling in favor of a position holding that Christ possesses 2 distinct natures, fully divine and fully human, existing together in one person. The Ethiopian Church, along with several other ancient Christian traditions, including the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Armenian Apostolic Church, and the Syriac Orthodox Church, rejected that ruling, holding instead to a Miaphysite position, the belief that Christ's divine and human natures are united into a single unified nature, rather than existing as 2 separate natures, side by side. That rejection permanently separated these churches, collectively known today as Oriental Orthodoxy, from the rest of the Christian world. And it's precisely that separation, that centuries-long isolation from the councils and institutions that would go on to shape the Western biblical canon, that set the stage for everything that makes the Ethiopian Bible so genuinely different from what most Christians read today. It's worth pausing on just how far-reaching that 5th century split actually turned out to be, because it didn't just separate a handful of regional churches over an abstract point of theology. Chalcedon effectively drew a line straight through the eastern half of the ancient Christian world. On one side, the churches that would go on to become Eastern Orthodoxy, and eventually Roman Catholicism after the later Great Schism, and on the other side, an entire family of older, geographically scattered churches, Ethiopian, Egyptian, Armenian, and Syriac Christians, that continued developing their own theology, their own liturgical traditions, and, crucially, their own sense of which ancient texts counted as scripture, almost entirely independent of the councils and reform movements that would go on to define Western Christianity for the next millennium and a half. Ethiopia's particular geographic isolation, separated from the Mediterranean world by the Red Sea and the mountainous terrain of the Horn of Africa, made that independence even more pronounced than it was for some of the other Oriental Orthodox churches, allowing Ethiopian Christianity to develop for centuries with remarkably little outside interference or correction. While European churches spent the following centuries debating, revising, and eventually standardizing which books belonged in their Bibles, largely through a series of later councils, and much later, the Protestant Reformation's own separate reassessment of the canon, the Ethiopian Church, cut off from those conversations by geography, theology, and history alike, simply kept using the much broader collection of scripture it had inherited from its earliest centuries as a Christian nation. The result, preserved and copied by hand for well over 1,000 years in Gaia's script, is what's now recognized as the largest biblical canon in the entire Christian world. The most commonly cited figure is 81 books, typically broken down as 46 books in the Old Testament and 35 in the New Testament, though you'll sometimes see the number cited as 88 instead, a discrepancy that comes down entirely to how certain grouped texts get counted. Several important ecclesiastical writings deeply revered within Ethiopian tradition, including a collection of church order documents called the Synodos, a set of writings called the Clementos attributed to Clement, and a text known as the Didaskalia, get counted as a handful of separate books by some scholars and publishers, and lumped together as single combined entries by others, which is why you'll find both numbers used more or less interchangeably in serious scholarship on the subject. Whichever number you use, the practical reality is the same. The Ethiopian Bible contains every single book found in the standard 66-book Protestant Bible, plus every additional deuterocanonical book recognized by the Catholic Church, and then it simply keeps going, adding an entire additional layer of ancient texts that exist as recognized canonical scripture nowhere else in the Christian world. And of all those additional texts, none has captured more attention from scholars and curious readers alike than the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch, sometimes called First Enoch to distinguish it from a couple of later unrelated texts that share the name, is an ancient Jewish apocalyptic work, most of it composed somewhere between roughly 350 BCA and the very beginning of the Christian era, attributed to the patriarch Enoch, a figure who appears only briefly in the actual book of Genesis, described in a single cryptic verse as a man who walked with God, and who, rather than dying like every other patriarch listed around him, was simply taken by God, vanishing from the earthly record entirely. That brief mysterious mention in Genesis became the seed for an entire sprawling tradition of later Jewish literature, exploring what exactly Enoch might have seen and learned during his time walking with the divine, and the resulting text is considerably stranger and considerably darker than most people expect from ancient religious writing. Enoch describes a group of angels called the Watchers, who descend to earth, become infatuated with human women, and take them as wives, a story rooted in a famously cryptic 4-verse passage from Genesis chapter 6, describing sons of God, intermarrying with daughters of men, and producing a race of giants called the Nephilim. Where Genesis leaves that story maddeningly brief and unexplained, Enoch expands it into a full, detailed narrative. The Watchers don't just intermarry with humanity, they actively teach forbidden knowledge to the human race, instructing people in metalworking and weapon-making, in cosmetics and the arts of seduction, in astrology and sorcery and the reading of omens, knowledge the text frames as fundamentally corrupting, directly responsible for the spread of violence and wickedness across the earth that eventually triggers God's decision to send the Great Flood. The children born from these unions, the Nephilim giants, are described as growing monstrous and destructive, consuming humanity's resources and eventually turning on each other and on mankind itself, their spirits, in the text's own telling, surviving even after their physical destruction to become the demonic forces still troubling the world. The text names the leaders of these rebel angels individually, most prominently a figure called Semjaza, described as the one who convinces the rest of the Watchers to descend and bind themselves by oath to carry out the plan together, and another called Azazel, credited specifically with teaching humanity how to forge weapons of war and instructing women in the use of cosmetics and jewelry to seduce men, knowledge the text treats, as a form of corruption, every bit as serious as the weapons themselves. Enoch describes God eventually dispatching the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel to bind the rebellious Watchers and imprison them until a final day of judgment, while Enoch himself is shown a series of visions detailing cosmic geography, the movements of the sun and moon, the storehouses of winds and stars, and a lengthy, detailed judgment scene describing the eventual fate awaiting both the fallen angels and corrupt humanity. It's a sprawling, genuinely strange text by any standard, part cosmic travelogue, part moral warning, part detailed angelic mythology, And it's precisely that strangeness that makes its near disappearance from most of Christian history and its quiet, careful preservation in Ethiopia such a remarkable story. It's easy to dismiss a text like this as obscure apocryphal fan fiction, interesting only as a curiosity, until you realize just how seriously ancient readers actually took it. The New Testament book of Jude, universally accepted as canonical scripture across every major Christian tradition, including the Protestant and Catholic Bibles most Western readers actually own, directly quotes the book of Enoch by name, citing a specific prophecy and explicitly identifying its source. Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men, saying, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all." That's not a vague thematic echo. That's a New Testament author directly citing Enoch as a genuine prophetic authority by name inside a book every major Christian tradition considers divinely inspired scripture. Early church figures took the text just as seriously for centuries afterward. Several prominent early Christian writers referenced it approvingly, treating it as legitimate scripture well into the early centuries of the church's existence. It wasn't until roughly 400 AD that Western church authorities formally excluded it from the developing canon, a decision that, as it happens, coincided almost exactly with the period when Ethiopian Christianity was establishing its own independent scriptural tradition, inheriting and preserving the very text the West was in the process of setting aside. For well over 1,000 years afterward, the Book of Enoch survived almost nowhere else on earth in complete form except inside Ethiopian monasteries, copied and recopied by hand in Ge'ez script, treated as genuine authoritative scripture by a church the rest of Christendom had, since Chalcedon, largely lost meaningful contact with. Fragments of the text turned up elsewhere over the centuries. A partial Greek translation covering roughly the first third of the text was discovered in Egypt in 1886, and the Church Fathers occasionally quoted small portions of it in their own writings. But the full text, in its complete form, survived nowhere else except in Ethiopia. European scholars only rediscovered it in the 18th century, when the Scottish explorer James Bruce, traveling in Ethiopia in search of the source of the Blue Nile, brought copies of the manuscript back to Europe, reintroducing a text that had been essentially unknown to Western scholarship for well over 1,000 years. Then, in the 20th century, came the discovery that transformed the Book of Enoch from an interesting Ethiopian curiosity into one of the most significant textual finds in modern biblical archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Between 1947 and 1956, a series of ancient manuscripts were discovered hidden inside caves near the ruins of Qumran, close to the Dead Sea, dating from roughly 150 BC to 70 AD, generally regarded as the single most important archaeological manuscript discovery of the entire 20th century. Among the thousands of fragments recovered from Qumran's caves were pieces of Aramaic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch itself, fragments of 11 separate Aramaic copies of the text, discovered specifically in Cave 4, alongside additional fragments of a related separate text called the Book of Giants that expands even further on the Nephilim narrative. This discovery proved something genuinely remarkable. The Book of Enoch wasn't some late, marginal invention, and it wasn't an Ethiopian addition grafted onto Christian scripture after the fact. It was a genuine, ancient Jewish text composed in Aramaic centuries before Christianity even existed, actively read, copied, and apparently deeply valued by the very Jewish community responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. In fact, by one striking measure, the community at Qumran seems to have valued Enoch more than most of what would eventually become the standard Hebrew Bible. Researchers examining the sheer number of manuscript copies found in the caves have noted that Enoch was represented by more copies than Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, both books of Samuel, Job, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and the minor prophets, trailing behind only Psalms and Deuteronomy in overall popularity among the texts the Qumran community chose to preserve. What makes the Ethiopian preservation of Enoch even more remarkable, once you compare it against what actually survived at Qumran, is just how much more complete the Ethiopic version turns out to be. The Aramaic fragments recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls cover only a fraction of the full text, roughly a fifth of the material found in the complete Ethiopic manuscripts, according to scholarly estimates, and notably, the specific fragments found at Qumran are missing an entire major section of the book, a portion called the Book of Parables, containing some of the text's most theologically significant material regarding a mysterious apocalyptic figure called the Son of Man, material that scholars believe provided important context for how that exact title would later be used throughout the New Testament Gospels. That section survives today only in the Ethiopic tradition. Put simply, without Ethiopian monks quietly copying this manuscript by hand for over a millennium, an entire portion of a text directly quoted in the New Testament, A text that may have shaped how early Christians understood one of Jesus' own most frequently used titles for himself would very likely be lost to history entirely. Enoch is far from the only unique treasure inside the Ethiopian canon, though it's certainly the most famous. Sitting alongside it is the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called Little Genesis, a text composed sometime in the 2nd century BC that retells the events of Genesis and the early portions of Exodus, restructured around a chronological system built on 49-year Jubilee cycles, adding considerable extra detail, dialogue, and theological interpretation to stories most readers already know from the standard Old Testament. Like Enoch, fragments of Jubilees also turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a number suggesting it, too, was treated as genuinely important scripture by the Qumran community, another ancient pre-Christian Jewish text that the Ethiopian church preserved in complete form while it faded into obscurity and eventual rediscovery everywhere else. Then there's the trio of books called Maccabean, translated into English as Maccabees, which immediately causes confusion for anyone familiar with the books of Maccabees found in Catholic Bibles, because despite sharing a name, the Ethiopian Maccabean texts are entirely different works, telling different stories with different characters, unrelated in content to the more widely known Maccabean histories describing the Jewish revolt against Greek rule. It's a small telling detail that captures something important about the entire Ethiopian canon. These aren't simply extra copies or alternate translations of texts found elsewhere. Many of them are genuinely distinct works, native to Ethiopia's own scriptural tradition, existing as scripture nowhere else on the planet. The Ethiopian Church's manuscript tradition carries its own separate, equally remarkable, claim to historical significance, entirely apart from which specific books made it into the canon. The Garma Gospels, 2 illuminated Ge'ez Gospel manuscripts housed at the Abba Garma Monastery near the town of Adwa in northern Ethiopia, were long assumed by outside scholars to be relatively late medieval productions, until radiocarbon dating conducted in the early 21st century placed their actual creation somewhere between roughly 390 and 660 AD. That dating makes the Garima Gospels, by wide scholarly agreement, the earliest complete illuminated Christian manuscripts known to exist anywhere in the world. Centuries older than the famous Book of Kells, the elaborately decorated Irish Gospel manuscript most Western audiences would immediately picture if asked to name history's oldest surviving illustrated Christian text. Ethiopian scribes, in other words, were producing biblical manuscripts of extraordinary artistic sophistication, while large portions of Europe were still emerging from the collapse of Roman infrastructure, and had barely begun developing their own comparable traditions of religious book production. All of this connects to a broader, deeper story. Ethiopian tradition tells about its own relationship to biblical history, one that extends well beyond the specific contents of its canon. Ethiopian religious and national tradition holds that the country's own royal line descends directly from a union between the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a story recorded in a text called the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings, which, while not itself part of the formal biblical canon, occupies an enormously important place in Ethiopian religious and cultural identity. That same tradition holds that the son born from that union, Menelik, later traveled to Jerusalem and eventually brought the Ark of the Covenant itself back to Ethiopia, where Ethiopian tradition maintains it remains to this day, housed inside a chapel at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the ancient city of Axum, guarded continuously by a single dedicated monk, chosen for life, who is the only person permitted to actually view it, a role passed down from guardian to guardian, in an unbroken chain the Church maintains has continued for centuries. Whatever one makes of the historical claims themselves, questions that remain genuinely, seriously debated among historians and biblical scholars, the tradition itself reflects the same underlying pattern found throughout Ethiopia's entire relationship with biblical history. A conviction, sustained across many centuries of relative isolation from the rest of the Christian and Jewish world, that Ethiopia's connection to the earliest chapters of that shared story runs exceptionally deep, deeper in the Church's own telling than outsiders have generally recognized. Stepping back from any single book or manuscript, what the Ethiopian Bible ultimately reveals is something genuinely important about how the Bible most Western readers grew up with actually came to look the way it does. The 66-book Protestant canon, and the slightly larger Catholic canon that includes several additional deuterocanonical books, can feel, to most readers who've never examined the history closely, like a fixed, settled, essentially inevitable collection, as though these were simply the books that were always understood to belong in Scripture and no others. The Ethiopian tradition quietly demonstrates that this was never really true. Canon formation was a long, genuinely contested historical process shaped by specific councils, specific historical circumstances, and specific communities making specific decisions about which ancient texts to preserve as authoritative and which to set aside, Decisions that different Christian communities, operating in different regions and different centuries, didn't always make the same way. The Book of Enoch wasn't invented by Ethiopian monks. It was a genuinely ancient, widely respected Jewish religious text, read and copied at Qumran, quoted directly by name in the New Testament itself, that Western Church authorities eventually chose to exclude from their own developing canon around 400 AD, at almost precisely the same moment Ethiopian Christianity was independently establishing its own scriptural tradition on the other side of the ancient world. One tradition preserved it, another set it aside. Both decisions shaped, in their own ways, the Bible their respective communities would go on to read for the next 1,500 years. Mitos. None of this is really a story about one version of the Bible being more correct than another. That's a theological question each tradition answers for itself, and it's not the kind of question textual history alone can settle. What the Ethiopian canon actually offers is something arguably more valuable than a verdict, a genuinely rare surviving window into just how much richer, stranger, and more theologically varied the ancient world's biblical literature actually was. Before centuries of councils, schisms, and reformations gradually narrowed most of the Christian world down to the more compact collections most readers know today. Somewhere in a rock-hewn church in the Ethiopian highlands, a text describing fallen angels teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity before the flood has been read aloud as sacred scripture, essentially without interruption, for close to 2,000 years, the very same span of time it spent almost entirely unknown to the rest of the Christian world. It took a set of scrolls hidden in desert caves near the Dead Sea, undisturbed for 2,000 years until a Bedouin shepherd stumbled across them by accident in 1947, to finally prove what Ethiopian monks had quietly known and quietly preserved the entire time. There's a particular kind of irony worth sitting with here, one that says something larger about how historical knowledge actually survives and gets rediscovered. For roughly 14 centuries, from the moment Western Church authorities set the Book of Enoch aside around 400 AD until James Bruce carried copies back from Ethiopia in the late 1700s, the text existed, as far as most of the world was concerned, only as scattered references in the writings of early church fathers and a handful of tantalizing quotations, a book people knew had once existed but assumed was permanently lost. It wasn't lost. It had simply moved carried along an entirely separate branch of Christian tradition that the rest of the Christian world had stopped paying attention to, copied faithfully, generation after generation, by scribes in a kingdom most European scholars had never visited and knew almost nothing about. And then, just as European rediscovery was finally making the text available to Western readers again, a set of scrolls that had been sitting untouched in the same set of desert caves since roughly the time of Jesus turned up entirely by accident, confirming that everything those Ethiopian scribes had been copying for 14 centuries traced back to something genuinely, provably ancient, older than Christianity itself. The canon Western Christianity settled on wasn't wrong to exist, but it also wasn't the only story the ancient world had to tell about itself, and for that other story, the one about a slightly larger, considerably stranger version of the Bible, we have a small, isolated church in the African highlands to thank for making sure it never actually disappeared,